Rain hammered the tin roof of the iron pit so hard the whole building seemed to vibrate. The sound swallowed everything else, the clink of bottles, the low hum of conversation, even the old jukebox wheezing out a country song no one was really listening to. It was Tuesday afternoon in Ashford, Kentucky, the kind of gray, wet day that made the highway empty and the bar half full. At the back table sat 12 men in leather vests, the same patch stitched on every back. Hell's Angels. People in Ashford knew that table. They knew to leave it alone. Bull sat at the head of it, massive hands wrapped around a beer bottle. 51 years old, thick beard shot through with gray. A jagged scar ran from his left ear down along his jawline like lightning frozen in skin. Across from him, Preacher was finishing a story from 30 years ago about a bar fight in Lexington. Diesel laughed loud enough to make the bottles rattle. Hammer leaned back in his chair, cracking his knuckles. For a moment, it looked like any other afternoon. Then the door slammed open. Cold air rushed inside with the rain. Water sprayed across the wooden floor. And standing in the doorway was a little girl, 5 years old. Blonde hair soaked and plastered to her forehead. A pink jacket 2 sizes too big hung off her shoulders, the sleeves swallowing her hands. Mud streaked the fabric. But that wasn't what made the room fall silent. She had no shoes. Her bare feet were muddy, raw, and bleeding where gravel had torn the skin open. Tiny red footprints dotted the floor as she stepped forward. Every conversation in the bar died. The bartender froze mid-pour. The 2 men playing cards by the window stopped mid-hand. But the girl didn't look at any of them. She ran straight across the room toward the back table, straight toward the Hell's Angels. The men at the table went still as statues. The little girl stopped in front of Bull. She was shaking so badly her whole body trembled. Rain dripped from her hair onto the floor. Bull slowly set his bottle down. He leaned forward, lowering his voice the way people do around injured animals. "Hey there, sweetheart." The girl didn't answer. Her chest rose and fell too fast, breaths coming in short bursts. Her lips had turned faintly blue from the cold. Bull glanced down again at her feet. Bare. Bleeding. Something in his chest tightened. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The girl swallowed hard. "Sophie," she whispered. Her voice was barely louder than the rain on the roof. "Sophie Dawson." Bull nodded slowly. "All right, Sophie." His voice stayed calm, careful. "Where's your mama?" The question broke something. Sophie's bottom lip started trembling. She tried to speak, but no sound came out at first. Then she raised one shaking hand and grabbed the collar of her oversized jacket. She pulled it down from her shoulder. Bull saw it, and every molecule of air left his lungs. Bruises, deep purple and yellowed green, layered on top of each other like storm clouds under her skin. Finger-shaped marks pressed into her tiny shoulder. A red mark wrapped around her neck, an unmistakable handprint. Behind Bull, Diesel's chair slammed backward as he shot to his feet. "Jesus Christ," Diesel muttered. Hammer's face drained of color. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. Preacher closed his eyes, lips moving silently. Whether he was praying or cursing, nobody could tell. Bull didn't move. He'd been shot at in Afghanistan. He'd pulled men out of burning vehicles. He'd carried friends who died before the helicopter arrived. None of it felt like this. Looking at the bruises on a 5-year-old child's body, Bull forced his voice to stay steady. "Who did this to you, Sophie?" The girl stared at the floor. Rainwater dripped from her hair onto the wood between her feet. "My mom says we have to stay quiet," she whispered. 8 words. Eight words that landed heavier than any punch. Bull felt the men around him stiffen. "You mama told you to stay quiet about this?" he asked softly. Sophie nodded. "She says if we tell anyone, he'll do worse." Her voice cracked. "But last night he hurt her real bad." Bull's stomach twisted. "Hurt your mama?" Sophie nodded again, wiping her nose with the sleeve that hung past her fingers. "She can't get up," she whispered. "I tried to wake her, but she just kept crying." Bull leaned forward a little more. "Who's he, Sophie?" She hesitated. Then the word came out like something poisonous. "Derek." The name hung in the air. "He lives with us," Sophie continued quietly. "He's not my daddy. My daddy left when I was a baby." Her eyes lifted slightly, meeting Bull's for the first time. "He was nice at first. she said. Then she shook her head. He's not nice anymore. The rain kept pounding the roof. Bull glanced around the bar. Every single person was watching, but no one spoke. Sophie sniffed and shifted her weight. One of her feet slipped slightly on the wet floor. Bull saw the blood again. "How far did you walk to get here?" he asked. She shrugged weakly. "I don't know. A long time. My feet hurt." Diesel turned away sharply, covering his mouth with his hand. Bull slowly pushed his chair back. The legs scraped across the floor. Then he stood, 6'4", shoulders like a brick wall. But when he stepped closer to Sophie, he lowered himself down onto one knee so his eyes were level with hers. Up close, the damage looked worse. Dark circles under her eyes, cheeks hollow with exhaustion. A child carrying something no child should carry. Bull placed one large hand gently on the shoulder that wasn't bruised. "Sophie," he said quietly. "Yeah? You did the right thing coming here." Her brow furrowed. "I did?" "Yes," Bull said. "You walked through that door and asked for help." He nodded once. "That's the bravest thing anyone's done in this bar in 20 years. Sophie stared at him, uncertain. "I was really scared," she admitted. "I didn't know where else to go." Bull glanced briefly at the other men at the table. Every single one of them was already watching him. Waiting. Bull looked back at Sophie. Something deep behind his eyes had changed. "Don't worry," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the entire room. "We're going to help you." And in that moment, without any of them saying it out loud, every man at that table understood exactly what was about to happen. For a few seconds after Bull spoke, nobody in the iron pit moved. Rain continued to pound the roof. Water dripped from Sophie's hair onto the floorboards between her small, bleeding feet. The jukebox hummed softly in the corner like it hadn't realized the room had changed. Bull stayed on one knee. He didn't rush her. Children who were frightened didn't respond well to pressure. He knew that much. "All right," he said gently. "Let's figure this out together." Sophie nodded, though the motion was small and shaky. Bull glanced up at the table behind him. 12 men watched him. No one needed to ask what came next. Bull turned back to the girl. "Where's your mama right now?" "Home," Sophie said. Her voice sounded thin, stretched tight by exhaustion. "Where's home?" "Pine Creek Trailer Park." Bull felt several men behind him shift in their chairs. Everyone in Ashford knew Pine Creek. "Which trailer?" he asked. "The yellow one," Sophie said. "Number 22. Bull nodded slowly. "And Derek?" "He's at work." "Where does he work?" "The lumber yard," she said quietly. "He leaves in the morning." Bull glanced at his watch. "Iki. Onbesh p.m. Do you know when he comes home?" 5. 3 hours. Bull's jaw tightened slightly. "Did he hurt your mama last night?" Sophie nodded. "He kicked her." The words came out flat, like something she had already said too many times. "She was on the floor and he kept kicking her," Sophie continued. "She couldn't get up this morning." Diesel made a sound behind Bull, something halfway between a breath and a curse. Bull ignored it. He kept his focus on Sophie. "Did you try to wake her?" "I tried," Sophie whispered. She kept crying. Her voice trembled. She kept saying sorry. Bull closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them again, his expression had hardened, though his voice remained gentle. "How long did you walk to get here?" Sophie shrugged weakly. "I don't know." "Did you walk the whole way?" "Yes." "In the rain?" She nodded. "My shoes got taken away." Bull frowned slightly. "Taken away?" Sophie looked down at the floor. "Derek threw them away last week," she said. "He said I left them by the door." Bull's hand curled slowly into a fist against his knee. Behind him, Hammer muttered under his breath. Bull rose to his feet. The movement seemed to break whatever spell had held the room frozen. Chairs scraped. Diesel stood fully now, pacing once across the wooden floor before stopping beside the table. Preacher leaned forward, elbows resting on the scarred surface of the wood. Wire was already pulling a laptop from his backpack. Bull turned back to Sophie. "Listen to me," he said softly. She looked up. "We're going to get your mama." Her eyes widened slightly. "Right now?" "Yes." Sophie hesitated. "What if Derek comes home early?" Bull held her gaze. For a moment, something heavy passed between them, something that didn't need words. "Then we'll deal with Derek," Bull said. Sophie studied his face carefully. Children who grow up around danger learn to read people fast. Bull could see the gears turning behind her eyes. Finally, she nodded. Okay. Bull glanced toward the bar. Josie. The bartender was already moving. She came around the counter carrying a glass of milk and a grilled cheese sandwich cut neatly into triangles. She placed them gently on the bar. Eat something, baby, she said. Sophie stared at the plate like she didn't trust it to stay there. Then her stomach growled loudly. Hammer looked up at the ceiling immediately. Sophie picked up one triangle and took a bite. Then another. Within seconds, she was eating fast, almost frantic. Josie's expression tightened. Bull watched quietly for a moment before turning back to his table. His voice changed. It wasn't louder, just colder. Diesel, he said. Diesel looked up. Get the van. Diesel was already halfway to the door. Bull continued. Wire. Wire's laptop was open before Bull finished the name. Pull up Pine Creek Trailer Park. Number 22. Derek Wade. Whatever you can find. Arrests, warrants, everything. Wire's fingers were already moving across the keyboard. On it. Bull looked at Preacher. Call Doc Mason. Preacher nodded once. Tell him we've got a domestic situation. Broken ribs minimum. Preacher pushed himself out of his chair and stepped toward the back door where the rain was quieter. Bull turned to Hammer. You stay here. Hammer blinked. With Sophie. Hammer straightened immediately. Yes, sir. Bull gestured toward the front entrance. Lock the door once we leave. Nobody comes in unless you know them. Hammer nodded. Josie added quietly. Shotguns under the counter. Hammer glanced over. Good. Bull looked around the room one last time. Every man there already knew their role. He turned back toward the bar. Sophie had finished the first sandwich triangle and was halfway through the second. Milk foam sat above her lip. For the first time since she walked in, she looked like what she was. Just a 5-year-old kid. Bull stepped closer and crouched down again. Sophie, she looked up. We're going to go get your mama. She swallowed. You promise? Bull didn't answer right away. Promises meant something to him. They always had. He held her eyes. I promise. Sophie stared at him for a long moment. Then she did something none of them expected. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. Her wet hair pressed against his cheek. Her small fingers gripped the leather vest at his shoulders. Bull froze for a fraction of a second. Then his massive arms came up slowly around her, careful not to squeeze too tight. Thank you, she whispered. Bull swallowed hard. After a moment, he gently set her back on the stool. Stay here, he said. She nodded. Bull turned and walked toward the door. Outside, the rain hit his face like cold needles. The black van was already running in the parking lot. Diesel sat behind the wheel. Wire climbed into the back seat with his laptop glowing in the dark. Bull pulled open the passenger door and slid inside. Talk to me, he said. Wire didn't look up from the screen. Derek Allen Wade, he said. 34. 2 assault charges. 1 domestic arrest in 2021. Convicted? No, victim recanted. Bull stared through the windshield at the sheets of rain. Of course she did. Wire kept typing. He did 6 months county 3 years ago for aggravated assault. Beat a guy outside a bar. Diesel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Bull exhaled slowly. Drive. The van rolled forward out of the Iron Pit parking lot. Behind them, the neon sign buzzed in the rain. And inside the bar, a 5-year-old girl in wool socks and an oversized t-shirt waited for 12 men to keep a promise. The black van cut through the rain like a shadow moving across the highway. Water streaked sideways across the windshield. Diesel leaned forward slightly over the steering wheel, squinting through the wipers as they slapped back and forth with steady urgency. No one spoke for the first minute. The road out of Ashford curved past a gas station, then a shuttered hardware store with plywood over the windows. The town faded quickly into wet fields and sagging fences. Wire finally broke the silence. His laptop screen glowed pale blue in the dark van. Found him, he said. Bull didn't turn around. Talk. Wire read as he typed. Derek Allen Wade, 34 years old, 6'1", 225. 2 prior assault charges. 1 dismissed, 1 pled down. Diesel exhaled slowly through his nose. Wire kept going. Domestic violence arrest in 2021, victim recanted. Bull's eyes stayed on the rain. "Let me guess," he said quietly. She recanted after he got home. Wire nodded, even though Bull couldn't see him. "Looks like it." Preacher shifted in the back seat beside him. "That happens a lot," the old man said. "More than people think." Wire scrolled further. "He did 6 months county 3 years ago. Aggravated assault outside a bar. Victim hospitalized." "Pattern," Diesel muttered. Bull glanced at the dashboard clock. "Iki, 20 p.m. 2 hours and 33 minutes until Derek Wade came home." Bull did the math automatically. "How far out are we?" he asked. 10 minutes, Diesel said. Wire tapped another key. "Got the mother's info, too. Megan Dawson, 28. No criminal record." Bull listened. "One daughter," Wire continued. "Sophie Rose Dawson, 5. The van hit a pothole and bounced. Diesel steadied the wheel. "What about the father?" Bull asked. Wire scanned again. "Travis Dawson. Divorce finalized 3 years ago. Last known address, Florida. Contact? Nothing since." Preacher leaned back in his seat. "So she's alone." Bull didn't answer. He was watching the road. The rain had started to ease, but the sky was still heavy and gray. They passed an old elementary school. Bull glanced at it as they drove by. A playground stood empty behind a chain-link fence, swings swaying slightly in the wind. Sophie should have been there, not walking barefoot through gravel and rain. Bull's jaw tightened. Wire spoke again. "Also, no child abuse record on Wade." Diesel let out a humorless laugh. "That doesn't mean anything." "No," Wire agreed quietly. "It doesn't." The van turned onto a narrower road. Mud and gravel replaced asphalt. Diesel slowed slightly. Pine Creek Trailer Park appeared around the bend like a broken row of teeth. The entrance sign hung crooked, half the letters missing. What remained read, "P-N-E-C-R-Co-T, A-A-R-P-A-Co." Rows of trailers leaned unevenly on rusted supports. Broken windows, sagging roofs, yards littered with scrap metal and old tires. Plastic bags tangled in the fences like ghosts. Bull had seen places like this before. Places where people heard screaming at night and pretended they didn't. Diesel drove slowly down the gravel lane. The tires crunched softly. 22 should be up ahead, Wire said. They passed trailer 17, then 19, then a rusted pickup truck sitting on blocks. Finally, Diesel slowed. There, the yellow trailer, except the paint had faded so badly it looked more like the color of a rotting tooth. One window was covered with cardboard and duct tape. The gutter sagged from one loose bracket. The front steps tilted slightly to one side. Bull opened the van door before the engine fully stopped. Cold air rushed in. Diesel stepped out beside him. Shadow and Knox moved quietly around the back of the van. Preacher stayed near the road, scanning the park. No one else seemed to be outside. The rain had almost stopped now. Only a light drizzle remained. Bull walked up the crooked wooden steps. They creaked under his weight. He stopped at the door. For a moment, he listened. Nothing, just the distant sound of a loose metal sheet rattling somewhere in the park. Bull knocked. 3 firm knocks. "Megan," he called through the door. His voice carried clearly. "My name is Bull." He waited. "Your daughter Sophie sent us." Diesel stood just behind his shoulder. "We're here to help." Silence. Bull knocked again. Harder this time. "Megan," he said, "I know you're scared." Another pause. "I know someone probably told you to stay quiet." Still nothing. Bull glanced at Diesel. Then he spoke again, louder. "Your little girl walked 40 minutes in the rain with no shoes to find someone who would help you." The words hung in the air. The trailer remained silent. Bull placed his hand flat against the door. "She's 5 years old," he said, "and she was brave enough to come ask strangers for help." He leaned closer. "Don't let that be for nothing." Inside, something shifted. A faint sound. Then a voice. Thin, fragile. "Please, go away." Bull didn't move. "If he finds out someone was here," her voice broke, "he'll kill us." Bull closed his eyes briefly. Then he spoke again. Calm. Steady. "Megan." He checked his watch. "Iki, otus dirt pam." Derek Wade gets off work at 5. Silence. "That's 2 hours and 26 minutes from now." Bull leaned closer to the door. "You've got 2 choices. Behind him, the men stood perfectly still. "Open this door," Bull said, "and let us help you." Another long pause. Or, "Stay behind it." He glanced once more at the watch. "And wait for him to come home." The rain dripped slowly from the edge of the roof. 10 seconds passed. 20. Then, the lock clicked. The door opened only a few inches at first. Bull didn't move. He kept his hands visible, palms relaxed at his sides. Slowly, the door creaked wider. Megan Dawson stood in the narrow gap. For a moment, no one spoke. She looked smaller than Bull expected, thin, pale. Her brown hair hung in tangled strands around her face like it hadn't been brushed in days. One eye was swollen, nearly shut. The other watched them with a kind of exhausted fear that didn't belong in anyone that young. Her lip was split. A deep bruise spread across her cheekbone like spilled ink. Bull had seen injuries before, but what caught his attention was the way she stood, half leaning against the wall behind the door, protecting her ribs without realizing she was doing it. Bull softened his voice. "Megan?" She nodded weakly. "You're Sophie's mom?" Another small nod. Her eyes flicked past Bull, scanning the men behind him. Leather vests, broad shoulders, hard faces. For a second, fear sharpened in her expression. "I didn't call anyone," she said quickly. "I swear I didn't." "You didn't have to," Bull replied gently. He stepped slightly to the side so she could see the empty road behind them. Sophie did. That seemed to hit her harder than anything else. Her shoulders sagged. She left? "This afternoon," Bull said. "She's safe." Megan's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, God. Tears welled in her one open eye. "I woke up and she was gone," she whispered. "I thought he took her." Bull shook his head. "She walked to town." The words hung there. Megan stared at him like she hadn't understood. "She walked?" she repeated faintly. "In the rain." The woman swayed slightly. Diesel took one step forward instinctively, but Bull raised a hand to stop him. Megan caught herself on the doorframe. "She doesn't even have shoes," Megan whispered. Bull didn't answer. He let the silence carry the truth. After a moment, he spoke again. "Can we come inside?" Megan hesitated. Old instincts warred behind her eyes. Then she stepped back. The inside of the trailer smelled faintly of stale air and something metallic. Bull stepped through the doorway. Diesel followed. Shadow and Knox moved in quietly behind them. The living room looked like a storm had passed through. A chair lay overturned. The television screen was cracked. One of the cabinet doors hung crooked from a single hinge. Bull's gaze swept the room once. Signs of violence were easy to read when you knew what to look for. A dent in the drywall, broken glass near the kitchen counter, and a smear of dried blood along the edge of the table. Megan lowered herself slowly onto the couch. The movement was careful, painful. Bull crouched down in front of her again. "Doc Mason's on his way," he said. She shook her head immediately. "No hospital." "No hospital," Bull agreed. "But someone needs to look at those ribs." Megan's arms tightened around herself. "He'll know," she whispered. "Paper trail." Bull nodded slowly. "We'll handle it." Her eyes flicked up again. "You don't understand," she said. "He always finds out." Bull held her gaze. "Not this time." For a moment, Megan looked like she wanted to believe him. Then, doubt crept back in. "He gets off work at 5, she said. "We know. He'll come straight here." Bull glanced at his watch. "Iki, kırk PM. We've got time." She laughed weakly. "You don't know, Derek." Bull didn't answer that. Instead, he stood and walked slowly through the small trailer. The bedroom door hung half open. Inside, a thin mattress sat crooked on a metal frame. A child's blanket lay tangled on the floor. Beside the bed was a small, stuffed bear. One eye missing. Bull picked it up gently. Biscuit. He brushed dirt from the fur and stepped back into the living room. Megan watched him. "Sophie won't sleep without that," she murmured. Bull nodded. "She'll have it tonight." He moved toward the small kitchen area. A photograph lay face down near the sink. Bull turned it over. It showed Megan sitting on a wooden bench at a county fair. Sophie, younger but unmistakable, sat in her lap holding cotton candy. Both of them were smiling. Bull studied it for a moment. Then he slipped the photo carefully into the inside pocket of his vest. Megan noticed. You don't have to. Yes, Bull said quietly. I do. Diesel stepped to the doorway and looked out toward the road. Still clear, he said. Bull turned back toward Megan. Listen to me, he said. We're getting you out of here. Her eyes widened. Where? Somewhere safe. Megan shook her head slowly. You don't understand. Help me understand. Her voice dropped to a whisper. If he comes home and we're gone, he'll hunt us. Bull walked closer. He already did. She frowned. What? Bull crouched again so they were eye level. Your daughter walked into a biker bar this afternoon, he said, and asked strangers to help her mom. Megan's eyes filled with tears again. Bull continued calmly. You know what that means? She shook her head. It means, Bull said, this stopped being Derek Wade's world about 3 hours ago. Behind him, the front door creaked. Doc Mason stepped inside carrying a worn black medical bag. Gray hair, weathered face, calm eyes. He looked around the destroyed room once, then at Megan. Well, he said quietly, looks like I showed up just in time. Megan stared at the older man. Doc Mason knelt beside the couch and gently touched her wrist. Let's see what we're working with. Bull stepped back slightly, giving him room. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The sky was still gray, but the air felt heavier now, like the calm before something worse. Diesel checked his watch. 2 p.m. Bull followed his gaze. 2 hours until Derek Wade came home, and the clock had started moving faster. Doc Mason finished taping the last strip of gauze across Megan's ribs and leaned back on his heels. Well, he said quietly, the good news is you're not dying today. Megan gave a weak breath that might have been a laugh. The bad news, Doc continued, is at least 2 ribs are cracked, maybe 3. You've also got a mild concussion. He looked up at Bull. She shouldn't be moved much. Bull nodded once. She shouldn't stay here. Doc followed his gaze around the trailer. Broken furniture. Blood on the table edge. The dent in the wall. Doc Sea-hilled. Fair point. Outside, Diesel stepped through the doorway again, rainwater still clinging to the shoulders of his jacket. Wire just texted, he said. Derek clocked out. Bull's head lifted. What time? Send in Sishawoofin. The room went quiet. Bull checked his watch. 2:47 p.m. 2 hours early. Megan's face drained of color. He never leaves early, she whispered. Bull stood immediately. Doesn't matter why. He looked at Diesel. How long to Haven House? 35 minutes if we push it. Doc Mason shook his head. She shouldn't be bouncing around a gravel road. Bull's voice stayed calm. She shouldn't be here when Derek Wade walks through that door. Doc looked at Megan. She nodded weakly. Move me. Bull turned. All right, we move now. Shadow and Knox stepped forward without being asked. Diesel headed straight for the door. The trailer suddenly filled with quiet, efficient movement. Knox grabbed a blanket from the bedroom. Shadow cleared the broken chair out of the narrow hallway. Doc Mason slipped pain medication into Megan's hand. Take this, he said gently. She swallowed the pills with a sip of water. Bull returned to the couch and crouched beside her. Can you stand? I'll try. Diesel and Knox lifted her carefully. Even with the medication, the movement pulled a sharp gasp from Megan's throat. Easy, Knox murmured. They wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and guided her slowly toward the door. Outside, the trailer park looked unchanged. Rusting fences, empty yards. A dog, barking somewhere far down the row. Bull scanned the road. No cars. Let's move, he said. Diesel opened the van's side door. They eased Megan into the back seat. Doc climbed in beside her immediately. Bull shut the door and stepped around to the front. Wire's voice crackled through Bull's phone. Bull, talk. I've got Derek's truck on traffic cam leaving the lumber yard. Bull climbed into the passenger seat. Direction? Westbound. Bull did the math instantly. That road led straight toward Pine Creek. How far out? Wire paused, calculating. 25 minutes if he drives normal. Bull looked at Diesel. Diesel was already starting the engine. How fast do you want to get there? Diesel asked. Bull stared through the windshield. Faster than him, the van rolled forward. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as Diesel steered them out of Pine Creek. Behind them, the yellow trailer shrank into the gray distance. In the back seat, Megan gripped the blanket tightly. "Where's Sophie?" she asked weakly. Bull glanced over his shoulder. "Safe. At the bar? For now." Her eyes closed briefly. She must have been so scared. Doc Mason checked her pulse. "She was brave," Bull said quietly. Megan opened her eyes again. "Where are you taking us?" "Haven House." She frowned slightly. "I've never heard of it." "Most people haven't." Diesel accelerated onto the main road. Rainwater sprayed out behind the van. Bull checked his watch again. 8:11 p.m. 8 minutes since Derek left work. Wire spoke again through the phone. "Bull, there's something else." "What?" He stopped. Bull turned slightly. "Stopped where?" "Gas station en route owns." Bull's jaw tightened. "Why?" Camera shows him going inside. Diesel glanced sideways. "Beer run?" "Maybe." Bull stared at the road ahead. "How long?" Wire watched the camera feed. "Still inside." Bull nodded once. "That buys us a few minutes." Behind them, Megan shifted slightly. "Is he coming home?" she whispered. Bull answered honestly. "Yes." Her fingers tightened around the blanket. "He'll be angry." Bull's voice stayed steady. "He won't find you there." The van sped past a faded church sign and a line of abandoned mailboxes. Fields stretched wide on either side of the road. The sky had turned darker again. Storm clouds gathering. Diesel checked the mirror. No traffic. Bull glanced back toward Megan. Doc Mason had one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "She's going to sleep soon," he said quietly. "Pain meds kicking in." Megan blinked slowly. "Tell Sophie." "I'm sorry," she murmured. Bull shook his head. "You can tell her yourself." She looked up at him. "You sure?" Bull didn't hesitate. "Yes." The van continued down the highway. Wire's voice returned. "Bull." "Yeah." "Derek's back in his truck." "How long was he stopped?" 4 minutes. Bull did the math. Derek Wade was now 21 minutes behind them. If he drove straight home, he'd reach Pine Creek to an empty trailer, and a house that suddenly felt very different than the one he left that morning. Bull leaned back in the seat. For the first time since they arrived at Pine Creek, the tight knot in his chest loosened slightly. They were ahead. Not safe yet, but ahead. The van pushed forward through the darkening afternoon, and somewhere behind them, Derek Wade was driving toward a house that no longer belonged to him. The road to Haven House left the highway after mile marker 19. Diesel turned the van onto a narrow dirt road that curved between thick pine trees. Gravel snapped under the tires. The forest closed in around them, swallowing the sound of the highway behind. Bull glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing but trees and gray sky. "Keep going," he said. Diesel nodded and drove another mile before the road opened into a clearing. A small cabin sat near the tree line. Weathered wood, wide porch, a single light glowing near the front door. Safe houses rarely looked impressive. That was the point. Diesel parked beside the porch. The van engine clicked as it cooled. Before Bull could open the door, the cabin door swung open. Grace Holden stepped outside. She was in her mid-40s, tall and composed, wearing a thick sweater and jeans. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose knot. She took in the scene quickly, the van, the men, the woman in the back seat. Grace had spent 15 years running Haven House. She knew exactly what she was looking at. "Bring her in," she said calmly. Knox and Diesel carefully helped Megan out of the van. The movement made her wince, but she managed to stay upright. Grace stepped forward immediately. "I'm Grace," she said gently. "You're safe here." Megan looked uncertain, eyes moving from the cabin to the men behind her. Grace placed a steady hand on her arm. "Come inside." Doc Mason followed them through the door. Bull remained outside for a moment. He scanned the tree line. Still quiet. Diesel stepped beside him. "You think Wade comes looking?" Diesel asked. Bull shrugged slightly. "Maybe. He know about this place?" "No." Diesel nodded once. "That's good." Bull finally stepped inside. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and fresh coffee. The living room was simple but warm, soft lamps, clean blankets, a worn sofa near the fireplace. And sitting on that sofa, wrapped in an oversized hoodie, was Sophie. She looked up the moment the door opened. For half a second, she just stared. Then she saw the woman being helped inside. "Mama?" She jumped off the couch and ran. Doc Mason barely had time to step aside. Sophie reached Megan and threw her arms around her waist. Megan gasped in pain, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she sank slowly to her knees, gathering her daughter into her arms. "Oh, baby," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my baby." Sophie buried her face in her mother's shoulder. "I thought you were dead," she cried. Megan held her tighter. "I'm here." "I'm so sorry I left," Sophie said quickly. "I didn't know what to do." "You did the right thing," Megan whispered. Behind them, Grace wiped her hands on a dish towel and stepped forward. "All right," she said gently. "Let's get you both sitting down before those ribs protest again." She guided Megan back toward the couch. Sophie refused to let go of her hand. Bull leaned quietly against the doorframe, watching. Grace noticed him. "You did good," she said softly. Bull gave a small nod. Doc Mason knelt again beside Megan to check the bandages. "Pain level?" he asked. "Manageable," Megan said. "Good." Gratrace disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a mug of tea. "Drink this," she said. "It'll help." Sophie sat close beside her mother, holding the stuffed bear Bull had brought from the trailer. The missing eye stared out crookedly. Bull recognized it immediately. "Biscuit." Sophie noticed him looking. "You found him," she said. Bull nodded. "Wouldn't leave a soldier behind." She smiled faintly. For the first time since he met her, the fear in her eyes had faded slightly, but only slightly. Grace sat in a chair across from them. "You two can stay here as long as you need," she said. "No one finds people who don't want to be found." Megan looked up slowly. "You're sure?" Grace smiled gently. "I've been doing this a long time." The room grew quiet. For a moment, it almost felt peaceful. Then Sophie spoke again. Her voice was small. "He's going to be really mad." The adults exchanged glances. Megan's shoulders tightened. Grace leaned forward slightly. "Who?" she asked softly. Sophie looked down at the floor. "Derek." Bull pushed away from the doorframe. "Derek's not coming here." Sophie shook her head slowly. "You don't understand." Bull crouched down in front of her again. "Try me." She looked up at him. "He doesn't listen to words," she said. Her voice was calm now, matter of fact, like someone explaining a rule. "He only understands bigger men." The sentence landed heavy in the room. Diesel let out a slow breath. Grace's expression hardened slightly. Bull studied Sophie for a moment. Children sometimes said things adults spent years refusing to admit. Bull stood again. "Well," he said quietly, "there are 12 of us." Diesel cracked a faint smile. Grace crossed her arms. "You're not planning something stupid, are you?" Bull glanced toward the window. The sky outside had darkened. Evening creeping in. He checked his watch. Alta, onbir PM. Derek Wade would have reached the trailer by now, and found it empty. Bull turned back to Grace. "No," he said calmly. "Just finishing something." Grace watched him carefully. "Bull," he paused. "If you go looking for trouble," she said, "you bring the law down on this place." Bull nodded. "Understood." Sophie's voice spoke again from the couch. "Are you going to talk to him?" Bull looked at her. "Yes." She held his gaze. "Good." Bull tilted his head slightly. "Why good?" Sophie hugged the stuffed bear tighter. "Because someone needs to tell him to stop." Bull studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once. "That's exactly what we're going to do." Outside, the forest had gone dark, and somewhere miles away, Derek Wade was standing in an empty trailer, realizing something in his life had just disappeared, and that someone else had taken it. Derek Wade pulled into Pine Creek Trailer Park at exactly 7:02 p.m. His truck headlights washed across the muddy lane as he turned off the main road. Gravel crunched under the tires. The engine idled rough, like it always did when he drove too fast. He was already irritated. The day at the lumber yard had been cut short because of rain. Half the crew got sent home early, and Derek had spent the last hour sitting in his truck at a gas station, drinking cheap beer and staring at the gray sky. Something had been bothering him all afternoon. A feeling, like something was off. The trailer park came into view. Derek slowed as he turned down the road toward his place. Trailer 22. Yellow paint faded and peeling. But something looked wrong immediately. The front door hung slightly open. Derek frowned. He shut off the truck and stepped out. The evening air was damp and heavy. The rain had stopped hours ago, but puddles still sat in the gravel. Derek slammed the truck door and walked toward the trailer. "Megan?" he called. No answer. He climbed the steps and pushed the door open wider. Inside, the place was empty. Too empty. The couch was bare. The kitchen counter cleared. The bedroom door hung open. Derek stepped inside slowly. "Megan!" he shouted. Nothing. He moved through the trailer quickly now. Bedroom. Bathroom. Closet. No one. The mattress had been straightened. The blanket gone. Even the stuffed bear Sophie usually carried everywhere was missing. Derek's jaw tightened. Where the hell? Then he saw the broken chair pushed aside in the hallway. And the footprints. Several sets. Large boots. Derek stepped back into the living room. The silence inside the trailer felt different now. Heavy. Like someone had been there recently. His eyes moved to the kitchen counter. One thing remained. A folded piece of paper. Derek picked it up. There were only 2 words written on it. "She's safe." Derek stared at the note. Then he laughed. A short, sharp sound. "You think this is funny?" His voice echoed in the empty trailer. He crumpled the paper in his fist. "You think you can take my family?" He turned toward the door and froze. Someone was standing on the porch. A large figure filled the doorway. Derek's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you?" The man stepped inside slowly. Tall, broad shoulders, gray threaded through a thick beard. A scar traced down his jaw like a lightning bolt. Bull. Behind him, another man stepped into view. Then another. 5 in total. Diesel leaned casually against the porch rail. Shadow stood silent near the steps. Knox and Preacher flanked the doorway. They weren't blocking the exit, but it certainly felt that way. Derek's hand moved toward the baseball bat leaning against the wall near the door. Bull noticed. His voice stayed calm. "I wouldn't." Derek grabbed the bat anyway. "Get out of my house." Bull didn't move. "This isn't about your house." Derek stepped forward, gripping the bat tightly. "You took my girl." Bull tilted his head slightly. "No. We removed 2 people you were hurting." Derek laughed again. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Bull took one slow step forward. "Your name is Derek Wade," he said calmly. Derek blinked. "What?" 34 years old, 6'1", 225. Derek's grip tightened slightly on the bat. Bull continued. "You broke a man's jaw outside Carson's bar 3 years ago?" Derek's expression shifted. "You got arrested for domestic assault in 2021. Derek didn't speak. "You kicked Megan Dawson last night until she couldn't stand." The bat lowered an inch. Bull's voice never rose. "And 4 days ago, you wrapped your hand around a 5-year-old's throat." The silence in the trailer thickened. Derek's eyes flicked toward the men behind Bull. "How do you know that?" Bull shrugged slightly. "Because people talk." Derek glanced at Diesel. Then Shadow. Then Knox. 5 men. All bigger than him. All watching. Bull took another step closer. "You know what else we know?" he said quietly. Derek didn't answer. "We know where you work." Bull ticked the points off calmly on his fingers. "We know your parole officer." Another finger. "We know the cameras at the gas station you stopped at today." Another. "And we know the sheriff's department still remembers your last assault charge." Derek's confidence began to drain. Bull leaned forward slightly. "You see the problem here?" Derek swallowed. "What problem?" Bull's voice softened. "You're not the biggest man in the room anymore." Diesel chuckled softly behind him. Derek's eyes flicked to the door. Bull noticed. "Go ahead," he said calmly. Derek frowned. "What?" "Leave." Derek blinked. "You're letting me walk?" Bull nodded. "You get in your truck." "You drive." "You keep driving." Derek stared at him. "And if I don't?" Bull glanced at the dent in the wall behind him. Then the dried blood on the table. Then back to Derek. "Then we finish this conversation a different way." The room went quiet. Derek looked down at the bat in his hand, then slowly lowered it. He stepped toward the door. The men outside parted slightly. Diesel watched him pass. Preacher didn't even blink. Derek walked down the steps and across the gravel to his truck. He climbed in and started the engine. The headlights flashed on. For a moment, the truck idled. Then Derek rolled down the window. He looked back at Bull standing in the trailer doorway. "This isn't over," Derek said. Bull met his eyes calmly. "Yes," he said. "It is." Derek stared at him another second. Then he shifted the truck into gear and drove out of Pine Creek Trailer Park. The red taillights disappeared down the dark road. Bull stood there for a moment longer, listening to the engine fade. Behind him, Diesel spoke quietly. "You think he's gone?" Bull stepped off the porch. "Men like him?" He watched the empty road. "They usually are." Then he turned back toward the trailer, until they realized the world just got a lot bigger than them. Morning came quietly to Haven House. The forest woke first. Wind moved through the pine branches outside the cabin, carrying the soft rustle of needles and the distant call of a crow. Sunlight filtered through the trees in thin, pale beams. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Grace was already awake. She stood at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee when she heard the small footsteps. Sophie appeared in the doorway of the hallway, still wearing the oversized hoodie she had slept in. Her hair stuck out in uneven strands, and she carried Biscuit tucked under one arm. Grace smiled gently. "Morning." Sophie didn't answer right away. She looked around the room. Different walls. Different furniture. It took a second for memory to catch up. Then she nodded slightly. "Morning." Grace slid a mug of hot chocolate across the counter. "Chocolate," she said. "Doctor's orders." Sophie climbed onto the chair slowly and wrapped both hands around the mug. The warmth seemed to wake her up more than the drink. "Where's my mom?" she asked quietly. Grace pointed toward the bedroom door. "Still sleeping. The medicine helps." Sophie nodded. Grace watched her for a moment. "You sleep okay?" Sophie shrugged. "A little." That was about as much honesty as a 5-year-old could manage. Grace didn't press. The front door opened, and Bull stepped inside. Cold morning air followed him. He paused when he saw Sophie at the table. "Well," he said, "you look like you survived the night." Sophie gave a small smile. "Barely." Bull raised an eyebrow. "That bad? I'm not used to beds that soft." Grace laughed quietly. Bull poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "You hungry?" Sophie nodded. Grace placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her. Sophie hesitated for a second. Then, lies, she began eating. Not frantic like the day before, just steady. Bull watched quietly. A child eating without fear of someone taking the plate away. It was a small thing, but it meant something. A door opened down the hallway. Megan stepped slowly into the living room. She moved carefully, one hand pressed lightly against her ribs. The swelling around her eye had faded slightly, though the bruises still painted shadows across her skin. Sophie jumped down from the chair. "Mama." Megan smiled weakly. "Easy, baby," she said softly, crouching as much as her ribs allowed. Sophie hugged her gently this time. Grace stepped closer. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Megan admitted. "Progress," Grace said with a small smile. Bull watched the reunion quietly. Megan looked over Sophie's shoulder and met his eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Megan said quietly, "Thank you." Bull shook his head once. "You don't thank someone for doing what should have been done already." Grace cleared her throat gently. "Which brings us to the next part." Megan looked at her. "What next part?" Grace pulled out a chair and sat down. "Safety is step one," she said. "But it's not the whole job." Megan listened. "You and Sophie can stay here a few days," Grace continued. "But long term, we need a plan." "Plan?" Megan repeated. "New place to live, new job, school for Sophie." The words sounded almost impossible. Megan glanced down at her daughter. "Is that even possible?" Grace nodded. "It's work," she said, "but it's possible." Bull spoke quietly from the counter. "We'll help." Megan looked up at him. "Why?" Bull considered the question for a moment. Then he answered simply, "Because someone should have done it sooner." The room fell quiet again. Sophie climbed back onto the chair and finished her toast. After a moment, she looked at Bull. "Is Derek gone?" Bull didn't lie. "He left town. Will he come back?" Bull took a slow breath. "Men like Derek sometimes try." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Okay." Grace raised an eyebrow. "That's all you've got to say about that?" Sophie shrugged. "If he comes back," she said, "we'll just leave again." Grace smiled faintly. "That's not a bad plan." The morning passed quietly. Doc Mason stopped by again to check Megan's ribs. Grace made phone calls from the back office. Diesel fixed a loose step on the porch. By afternoon, Sophie had discovered the small clearing behind the cabin where sunlight reached the ground. Bull found her there, sitting on a fallen log. Biscuit rested beside her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She shrugged. "School." Bull sat beside her. "You like school?" "Yes." "What do you like about it?" Sophie thought for a moment. "Recess." Bull chuckled. "That tracks." She picked up a small pine cone and rolled it between her fingers. "Do you think I'll go back soon?" "Yes." "How do you know?" Bull leaned back slightly against the log. "Because kids deserve normal things." Sophie seemed satisfied with that answer. The forest stayed quiet around them, peaceful. For the first time in days, the world felt almost calm. But calm didn't mean finished. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Grace and Bull sat at the kitchen table reviewing paperwork. Addresses, job listings, school districts. A phone rang on the counter. Grace glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Then she answered, "Haven House." Silence. Then a man's voice. Low. Rough. "I'm looking for Megan Dawson." Grace's expression hardened. "I think you have the wrong number." She hung up. Bull watched her. "You think that's him?" Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out the dark window toward the forest. After a moment, she said quietly, "I think someone just remembered what they lost." The call lasted less than 10 seconds, but it changed the room. Grace slowly placed the phone back on the counter. The kitchen felt smaller now, the quiet heavier than it had been moments before. Bull watched her from across the table. "What did he say?" Grace folded her arms. "Nothing useful." "That doesn't sound like nothing." She looked at the phone again. "He asked for Megan." Bull leaned back slightly in the chair. "That's it?" Grace nodded. "No threats, no yelling, just asking." Bull's eyes narrowed. "Men like Derek don't call to ask questions," he said quietly. "They call to confirm things." Grace understood immediately. He's checking if he found the right number. Bull nodded once. "And now he knows," someone answered. Grace sighed. "Which means he knows Megan isn't in that trailer anymore." The two of them sat in silence for a moment. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees around the cabin. Bull finally stood. "I'll make a few calls." Grace didn't stop him. Bull stepped outside onto the porch and pulled his phone from his pocket. The night air was cold. He dialed the first number from memory. The line clicked after 2 rings. Ford. "Hank, it's Bull." A pause. "Well, hell," the voice said. "Didn't expect to hear from you tonight. Need a favor." That usually means trouble. Bull stared into the dark forest. "Derek Wade." Another pause. "I know the name," Hank Ford said slowly. "Small-time hothead. County record. He left town yesterday. And you want to know where he went." "Exactly." Hank sighed. "Give me a few hours. Sooner if you can." "All right," Hank said. "But Bull?" "Yeah. If Wade's already calling around, he's not done." Bull knew that already. "Let me know what you find." He hung up. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Grace stepped onto the porch. "You tracking him?" Bull nodded. Grace wrapped her sweater tighter against the cold. "Think he's coming here?" Bull shook his head. "No." Grace waited. "He's smarter than that," Bull said. "Right now he's angry. But anger fades. And then? Then it becomes planning." Grace studied his face. "That worries you." "Yes." Grace leaned against the porch railing. "What happens if he finds them again?" Bull didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the dark line of trees beyond the clearing. "Then we end it." Grace turned her head slightly. "Bull." He looked at her. "You know I can't have violence tied back to this place." "I know." She searched his face. "You're not planning something illegal, are you?" Bull shrugged faintly. "Depends what Derek Wade decides to do next." Grace hid. "I was hoping for a more comforting answer." Inside the cabin, the floor creaked softly. Sophie appeared in the doorway. She rubbed one eye sleepily. "Why are you guys outside?" Grace immediately softened. "Couldn't sleep?" Sophie shook her head. "I heard the phone." Bull crouched down slightly so they were closer to eye level. "Bad dreams?" Sophie nodded. Grace knelt beside her. "You want some warm milk?" Sophie shook her head again. Is Derek coming back? Bull and Grace exchanged a glance. Bull answered carefully. We don't know. Sophie looked down at the wooden porch boards. Then she said quietly, I think he will. Bull studied her. Why? Sophie hugged Biscuit a little tighter. He doesn't like losing. The simple certainty in her voice hung in the air. Grace brushed a strand of hair away from Sophie's face. Even if he tries, he won't find you here. Sophie looked up. How do you know? Grace smiled gently. Because this place is built to keep people safe. Sophie seemed to think about that. Then she nodded slowly. Okay. Bull stood again. Go back to bed, he said softly. You've got a big day tomorrow. What big day? Grace answered. We're looking at a new school. Sophie's eyes widened slightly. Really? Yes. A small smile appeared on her face. Okay. She turned and padded quietly back inside the cabin. The door closed behind her. Grace watched it for a moment. Then she spoke quietly. She's stronger than she should have to be. Bull nodded. Kids like that usually are. Grace leaned against the railing again. The forest stayed still around them. 10 minutes passed. Then Bull's phone buzzed. Hank Ford. Bull answered immediately. What have you got? Your friend Wade didn't go far, Hank said. Bull waited. He's in Reno. Bull frowned. Nevada? Truck stop motel. Cash payment. Fake name. But the cameras caught him. Bull exhaled slowly. Good. Bad news, though, Hank continued. Bull's expression hardened. What? He wasn't alone. Bull straightened slightly. Who? Woman named Tammy Salt, half-sister. Bull recognized the name from Wire's earlier search. She's got a record, Hank added. Fraud, theft, harassment. Grace watched Bull's face change. What does that mean? She asked quietly. Bull lowered the phone. It means Derek didn't come back himself. Grace frowned. Then who made the call? Bull slipped the phone back into his pocket. He looked out into the darkness again. It means Derek's already sending someone else. Grace's stomach tightened. Someone who knows where Megan used to live. Bull nodded. And someone who doesn't care about rules. Inside the cabin, the lights glowed warm and quiet. Safe. For now. But Bull knew something important had changed. Derek Wade wasn't just angry anymore. He was thinking, and men like that were always more dangerous once they started planning. The bakery smelled like cinnamon and warm bread. Morning sunlight poured through the wide front windows, turning the wooden floors golden. Outside, Millfield's main street was already busy people heading to work, cars moving slowly past the row of small shops. Inside Dawson's Flour and Sugar, the line for coffee had started forming. Megan Dawson stood behind the counter tying her apron. She moved differently now. The old injuries had healed long ago, but the memory of them had shaped the way she carried herself steady, deliberate, strong in quiet ways. Table 3 needs another latte, one of the employees called. On it, Megan replied. Behind her, the bell above the door jingled. Megan glanced up automatically and smiled. Sophie stepped inside. She was 23 now, tall, confident, wearing a navy blazer and carrying a leather satchel over her shoulder. Her blonde hair was tied back in a loose braid, but some things hadn't changed. The same thoughtful eyes, the same calm way of moving through a room. You're early, Megan said. Sophie shrugged. Meeting got canceled. She stepped behind the counter and kissed her mother on the cheek. How's business? Busy, Megan said with a proud smile. Which is exactly how I like it. Sophie nodded. The bakery had started small. Just a counter and 3 tables. Now the place stayed full most mornings. People liked the pastries. But they also liked the story. Megan wiped her hands on a towel. You going to the center today? Yeah, Sophie said. Second Dawn. The name hung quietly between them. A small advocacy center 2 blocks away. Counseling. Emergency housing coordination. Legal referrals. The kind of place Megan and Sophie once needed. You're still coming to dinner tonight? Megan asked. Of course. Megan smiled. Bull's bringing Lily, too. Sophie laughed softly. I swear Diesel's daughter practically grew up in that bar. She practically grew up with you, Megan corrected. Sophie nodded. That was true. Some bonds were strange that way, built from chaos, lasting longer than anyone expected. Megan reached under the counter and pulled out a small wrapped box. For you, Sophie frowned. What's this? Open it. Sophie carefully removed the brown paper. Inside was a simple photograph frame. The photo inside showed two people sitting on a bench at a county fair. A younger Megan, and a little girl holding cotton candy. Sophie blinked. I thought we lost this. We did, Megan said softly. Bull kept it. Sophie looked up. He what? He said you might want it someday. Sophie traced the edge of the frame with her finger. The memory of the photo was old, but the meaning had changed. She set it gently inside her satchel. I'll thank him tonight. Megan nodded. The bell above the bakery door rang again. A woman stepped inside. Early 30s. Tired eyes. A small boy clung to her coat sleeve. He looked about 5. Megan noticed immediately. She had learned to notice things like that. The way the woman's shoulders stayed tense. The way the boy watched the room carefully. The woman stepped hesitantly toward the counter. Excuse me, she said quietly. Megan opened her mouth to greet her, but Sophie had already turned. Hi, Sophie said gently. The woman looked relieved. Someone noticed her. Someone told me this bakery might know where the Second Dawn Center is. Sophie smiled softly. You found the right place. The woman hesitated. I wasn't sure. That's okay. The boy shifted slightly beside her. Sophie noticed something immediately. His shoes. Old. Worn thin. The laces tied unevenly. Mud along the sides. A memory flickered through her mind. Bare feet on wet pavement. Cold rain. Fear. Sophie knelt down slowly so she was eye level with the boy. Hey, she said. The boy watched her cautiously. What's your name? Liam. I'm Sophie. She glanced at his shoes again. Then, back at him. You walked here with your mom? He nodded. From the bus stop. Sophie smiled. That's a pretty long walk. He shrugged. I don't mind walking. Something in that answer echoed across years. Sophie stood and turned toward the hallway behind the counter. Mom, I'll be back in a second. She disappeared briefly into the back room. When she returned, she carried a small box. She knelt again beside Liam. Inside the box was a pair of children's sneakers. New. Blue. Try these, she said. Liam looked at his mother. The woman nodded uncertainly. Sophie helped him slip the shoes on. They fit. Almost perfectly. Liam stood up and took a few steps. He looked surprised. They're really comfortable. Sophie smiled. Good. The woman wiped her eyes quickly. I don't know how to thank you. Sophie shook her head. You don't have to. She stood and picked up her satchel. The center's 2 blocks that way. She pointed through the window toward the street. I'll walk with you. The woman nodded gratefully. Sophie held the bakery door open. Liam stepped outside first. The morning sun hit the sidewalk. He looked down at his new shoes as he walked. Sophie followed behind him. For a moment, she paused on the sidewalk. Across the street, a familiar motorcycle rolled slowly past. Bull, older now, more gray in his beard, but the same scar. He lifted 2 fingers from the handlebars in greeting. Sophie smiled and lifted her hand back. Then she turned toward Liam. Ready? He nodded. Together, they started walking down the street. And somewhere deep in Sophie's memory, a promise made in a quiet bar years ago kept echoing forward. Someone asked for help, and she answered,